Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solis Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we examine large-scale unrest in Argentina, following the approval of a deeply controversial labor reform, with further strikes and violent protests highly likely in Buenos Aires and other urban centers. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we assess a surge in avalanche fatalities across the Alpine region amid severe winter conditions, continuing protests in Bosnia and Herzegovina following a fatal tram derailment in Sarajevo, stalled trilateral negotiations on Ukraine as Moscow hardens its posture while sustaining military pressure, heightened escalation risks between the United States and Iran amid a significant U.S. military buildup, and a social media ban in Gabon that is likely to trigger further anti-government protests. And in Asia-Pacific, we examine Bangladesh's post-election environment, where the opposition's acceptance of results reduces the immediate threat of large-scale unrest, although politically motivated violence remains likely in the short term. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where Argentina has seen large-scale protests following parliamentary approval of a structural labor reform backed by President Javier Milei. On February 12th, Argentina's Senate gave its in-principle approval to a sweeping labor reform that Milei has presented as central to his libertarian agenda. The reform extends the working day to 12 hours, reduces the power of labor unions by allowing company-level bargaining and removing the automatic payment of membership dues, narrows the grounds for wrongful dismissal claims, restricts the right to strike, and lengthens probation periods for workers, among other measures. In practice, it dismantles the long-standing Peronist labor system, which has been heavily dominated by Argentina's unions. The Senate vote was followed by immediate large-scale protests, called jointly by labor unions and opposition left-wing parties. Demonstrations had already begun on February 11th and turned violent in Buenos Aires, where police used water cannons and other crowd control measures near the capital. On February 16th, the General Confederation of Labor announced a 24-hour national strike for February 19th to protest against the reform. The Maritime and River Trade Union Federation also declared a 48-hour strike across all Argentine ports beginning on the same day. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Despite significant pressure, the labor reform package is likely to pass its final parliamentary vote, which could take place as early as February 19th. Even so, the strong public opposition to the bill has pushed the governing coalition to make several notable concessions. For example, on February 17th, it withdrew an article that would have allowed employers to reduce workers' salaries during periods of approved medical leave. Milei's libertarian policy agenda remains highly polarizing in Argentina, which continues to struggle with high poverty and unemployment despite a recent fall in the overall inflation rate. Even so, the October 2025 legislative elections, convincingly won by Milei's La Libertad Avanza with about 40.6% of the vote, have almost certainly given the president substantial political momentum. This has cleared the way for ambitious proposals such as the Labour Bill. Crucially, LLA's strong performance reduced the opposition's parliamentary numbers to the point where they can no longer override presidential vetoes, a tool Milei has repeatedly used to block opposition-led legislative efforts. Further developments in the bill's approval process will likely trigger additional unrest, with Buenos Aires almost certain to remain the main focal point for protests. If the lower house votes on the bill on February 19th, unrest is highly likely between February 19th and 21st. As seen during other recent periods of large-scale labor-related unrest in Argentina, future demonstrations are likely to turn violent and prompt the use of tear gas, water cannons, and other crowd dispersal measures. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where severe winter conditions have driven avalanche danger to critical levels across France, Switzerland, Austria and Italy. Multiple avalanche warnings have been issued across the Alps following recent heavy snowfall, strong winds and an unstable snowpack. In France, Météo France has placed departments under elevated avalanche alerts at orange or level 4, with some sectors issued red alerts. In Switzerland, official bulletins have warned of widespread avalanche danger across the Swiss Alps. In the canton of Valais, the alert level was raised to 5 out of 5 on February 18th, with local authorities urging travellers to exercise extreme caution. The escalation followed the derailment of a train in Valais, caused by an avalanche, which left several people injured. In Italy, high-risk avalanche alerts have been issued for parts of the Northern Alps. Austria's National Avalanche Service issued warnings of a precarious snowpack across large areas of Tyrol, Salzburg, and Carinthia. The alerts follow a series of recent fatal avalanche incidents across the Alps. On February 13th, a large avalanche in the Val d'Isère area of the French Alps killed 3 skiers, 2 British nationals and their French instructor. On February 15th, an avalanche in the Courmayeur area killed 2 off-piste skiers, while separate avalanches near French resorts caused at least 3 further deaths. Multiple ski resorts have fully or partially closed runs because of the heightened danger. Curfews have been imposed, and in some cases the authorities have evacuated entire alpine communities. Now, our intelligence assessment. At least 86 avalanche fatalities have been recorded so far during the 2025-26 alpine ski season. This total has already surpassed the 2024-25 season, which recorded 70 fatalities. The number of deaths is highly likely to rise, as the alpine ski season typically continues until late April at lower altitude resorts and into May in higher altitude glacier areas. Most fatalities have occurred in off-piste areas and backcountry terrain, largely due to unstable snowpack conditions created by persistent weak layers, buried bands of fragile, poorly bonded snow, or wind slabs, dense accumulations of wind-drifted snow that can crack and trigger avalanches under a skier's weight. Rescue efforts have been hampered by heavy snowfall, poor visibility, high winds, and the risk of secondary avalanches. In many incidents, avalanches have carried skiers hundreds of meters from where they were traveling and buried them under several meters of snow, sharply reducing survival windows. In multiple cases, skiers have ignored avalanche warnings and failed to carry essential safety equipment such as shovels or avalanche beacons, radio transceivers that emit and receive signals to help rescuers locate buried victims quickly. Continued snowfall, strong winds and fluctuating temperatures across the Alps are likely to keep avalanche danger at high or very high levels in the coming days. This will almost certainly lead to further transport disruption, including delays and closures on road and rail networks, as well as the full or partial closure of ski runs. Secondary impacts are also likely, including business closures, power cuts, pressure on emergency services, and supply chain disruption in mountainous areas. Staying in the region, protests have continued in Sarajevo following a fatal tram derailment that has intensified public frustration over infrastructure and governance. On February 14th, demonstrations were held in front of the National Museum following a tram accident 2 days earlier that killed 1 person and injured 4. The derailment occurred at a tram stop in front of the National Museum, severely damaging the station in what is now considered one of the worst tram incidents in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Protesters held banners and called on Sarajevo Canton authorities to explain why old trams were still in use, despite new units having been purchased. Protests have continued daily, with several thousand people gathering at midday and marching through the city. They have remained largely peaceful, but the marchers have blocked traffic in central Sarajevo. On February 17th, turnout fell to around 100 participants because of adverse weather. However, demonstrations continued into February 18th, although the number of participants on that day has not been confirmed. On February 15th, the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Sarajevo Canton announced that 5 people had been detained for carrying illegal items, including pyrotechnics, objects capable of causing injuries, and clothing intended to conceal the face. The following day, a torch was briefly lit before organizers intervened and extinguished it. Further arrests took place on February 16th, amid reports that police had surrounded groups of students and carried out mass detentions. On February 15th, Sarajevo Canton's Prime Minister, Nihad Uk, resigned. This was followed on February 16th by the resignation of Senad Mujagic, the director of Bosnia and Herzegovina's state-run transportation company. Protesters have also demanded the resignation of the cantonal Minister of Education, Nida Hotamuminovic, along with further investigations into the transportation company. Now, our team's assessment. Sarajevo is in the midst of modernizing its tram fleet, having reconstructed its tram lines in September 2023 and received its first new trams in more than 40 years in May 2024. The vehicles were purchased with a €10 million loan from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development under the Green Cities Initiative. Despite this investment, a substantial number of older second-hand trams continue to operate alongside the new fleet. Protesters have demanded that these older units be withdrawn from service, criticizing the government for taking action only after problems occur. Protests broke out across several Balkan countries in 2024 and 2025, prompting some observers to speak of a Balkan Spring. In November 2024, demonstrations erupted in Novi Sad, Serbia, after the collapse of a railway station canopy, and they have continued into 2026. In March 2025, a nightclub fire in Kočani, North Macedonia, triggered mass protests in Skopje and other major cities. Infrastructure failures often signal deeper governance deficiencies and can act as catalysts for broader social mobilization. Despite the smaller turnout on February 17th, there is a realistic possibility that protests in Bosnia and Herzegovina will persist, grow in scale, and potentially spread to other major urban centers. While they are likely to remain peaceful, they are highly likely to cause transport disruption. From there, we look at Ukraine, where trilateral negotiations in Geneva have failed to produce a breakthrough on territorial questions, even as Russia maintains sustained military pressure. On February 17th and 18th, the third round of US-Russia-Ukraine talks took place in Geneva. For this round, the Russian delegation was led by a new chief negotiator, Vladimir Medinsky, an aide to President Vladimir Putin. The talks ran late on February 17th, but concluded after only 2 hours on February 18th, with both Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Medinsky describing them as difficult. Zelensky publicly criticized what he sees as unequal US pressure on Ukraine to make concessions rather than on Russia, and voiced skepticism about claims from US mediators Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner that Russia genuinely wants to end the war. The military track was reportedly more productive, covering prisoner-of-war exchanges and arrangements for monitoring a potential ceasefire. It has been mostly agreed that a US-led mechanism could oversee ceasefire monitoring using drones. However, Ukraine continues to push for European participation, which Russia has so far rejected. However, the political track failed to produce any breakthroughs and is reportedly stuck. The main point of contention was territory, particularly Russia's demand that Ukraine withdraw from unoccupied sections of Donbass. US mediators proposed an arrangement in which a Ukrainian withdrawal would allow the area to become a demilitarized, free economic zone, with no clear position on its sovereignty. Ukraine has indicated a willingness to discuss a troop pullback, but insists that Moscow must also withdraw its forces by an equivalent distance. Kyiv has rejected any assertion of Russian sovereignty over the proposed zone. Now our assessment. It is highly likely that the replacement of Russia's previous chief negotiator with Medinsky is intended to harden Moscow's negotiating posture and align it more closely with President Putin's ideological focus on the root causes of the conflict. Zelensky has accused Moscow of stalling by appointing Medinsky, who has shown a marked interest in discussing the conflict's historical roots, echoing Putin's frequent rhetoric. Putin has repeatedly invoked claimed historical justifications for Russia's position on Ukraine, even referring to figures such as the 11th century Prince Yaroslav the Wise to bolster Russia's claims over Ukrainian territory. These alleged root causes are almost certainly used by the Kremlin to support more maximalist demands that fundamentally undermine Ukrainian sovereignty, including calls for demilitarization or so-called denazification, meaning regime change. Moscow will highly likely step up efforts to engage Washington separately through economic inducements, with President Donald Trump's administration almost certainly particularly receptive to what has been described as transactional diplomacy. Recently, the influential Kremlin figure and businessman Kirill Dmitriev publicly argued for the lifting of U.S. sanctions, claiming they have cost U.S. businesses more than $300 billion. He suggested that removing them would unlock a portfolio of potential U.S.-Russia projects worth over $14 trillion, a figure 6.5 times larger than Russia's entire GDP. Moscow is highly likely to remain engaged in talks to stave off increased U.S. pressure, with U.S. mediators continuing, at least publicly, to interpret Russian participation as meaningful and serious. However, the Kremlin is unlikely to accept any agreement that does not secure Russian sovereignty over the entire Donbass, along with other maximalist objectives, while it still holds a military advantage. A fundamental gap almost certainly remains between the Kremlin's belief that military force will ultimately deliver its desired outcomes and Kyiv's extreme reluctance to concede its most defensible line in the remaining unoccupied Donbass fortress belt without credible and robust guarantees against a future Russian resumption of the conflict. It is unlikely that the ongoing trilateral negotiations will produce a peace deal in the short to medium term. In direct contrast to Witkoff and Kushner's assertions that Moscow is seriously engaging to end the war, the heads of 5 European intelligence agencies have told international media that Russia has no intention of ending the conflict quickly, with 4 stating that the Kremlin is using the talks to secure sanctions relief and business deals. Russian forces continue to apply a high degree of military pressure on Ukraine. However, current environmental conditions are not conducive to ground offensives, making large-scale, longer-range strike packages the clear priority for now. On the eve of the Geneva talks, Russian forces launched another major wave of attacks, using 435 attack drones and decoys and 29 missiles. The strikes caused power outages in Kharkiv Oblast and Odessa city, and all 4 launched Iskander-M ballistic missiles found their targets, a development that almost certainly underscores the vulnerability of Ukrainian air defenses to ballistic threats. It is likely that Moscow will maintain a dual-track approach, remaining engaged in talks to stave off U.S. pressure while sustaining maximum military pressure on the ground. Without a peace deal beforehand, which remains unlikely, Russian forces are likely to launch major ground offensives once the spring mud season comes to an end. Also in the region, US-Iran negotiations have stalled as Washington accelerates its military deployments to the Middle East, significantly raising escalation risks. On February 17th, the US and Iran held a second round of negotiations in Geneva. Iranian officials described the talks as constructive, indicating that both sides had agreed on a set of guiding principles for future discussions. No substantive agreements were reached, but Iranian officials said Tehran will present detailed proposals within the next 2 weeks to help narrow remaining gaps in the nuclear talks. However, sources close to President Trump have indicated that he is becoming increasingly frustrated with what he sees as insufficient progress, with one source suggesting there is a 90% chance of U.S. military action in the coming weeks. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance also stated that Iran is ignoring key U.S. demands and red lines, including a commitment to suspend nuclear enrichment. The U.S. has continued to deploy additional military assets to the region. On February 17th and 18th, a further 50 F-16, F-22 and F-35 fighter jets were sent to the Middle East, supported by additional air-to-air refueling aircraft. 12 F-22s, supported by KC-46 tankers, also departed the US and arrived at RAF Lakenheath in the UK, a key staging ground for forward deployments to the Central Command area of responsibility. On February 18th, the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group transmitted its position as being off the coast of Morocco. Based on its heading and estimated speed, the group may already have transited the Strait of Gibraltar to enter the Mediterranean Sea as of February 19th, unless it was replenished at sea west of the strait. Further deliveries of air defense systems to U.S. regional bases have also been observed. Iran has responded to the U.S. military buildup by conducting naval exercises simulating the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, warned that Iran has the capability to sink any U.S. aircraft carrier, adding that many of Iran's most dangerous weapons remain classified. These threats were followed by the issuance of a notice to airmen by Iran's Federal Aviation Administration. The NOTAM outlined a large irregular airspace corridor originating deep within Iranian territory and extending southeast across the country towards the Gulf of Oman, where it terminated. Undisclosed Israeli officials have indicated that Tel Aviv is preparing for a possible military conflict within a matter of days. They assess that Iran would fire missiles at Israel, even if the Israel Defense Forces do not participate in potential U.S. strikes. Israeli assessments also suggest that President Trump is inclined to launch a large-scale military attack on Iran in response to Tehran's refusal to meet U.S. demands. On February 18th, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu instructed the Home Front Command to prepare for a potential war with Iran, and a state of maximum alert was declared across multiple Israeli security agencies. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. After transiting the Strait of Gibraltar, the Ford Carrier Strike Group is expected to reach its station in the eastern Mediterranean within the next 4 to 5 days, provided it maintains its current course and speed and does not make any port calls. This timeline could be longer if the eastern Mediterranean is not its final deployment area. However, the U.S. is likely reluctant to position such a high-value asset in the Red Sea or the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, given the elevated threat environment. Once in theater, the Ford Strike Group will bring the U.S. naval presence near Iran to an estimated 11 destroyers, 2 carriers, and 3 submarines. The group will also add around 40 to 48 FA-18EF Super Hornets, a squadron of EA-18G electronic warfare aircraft, and E-2D airborne early warning platforms, considerably expanding U.S. operational flexibility, deterrence, and both strike and counter-strike options across the region. The accelerated pace of U.S. deployments follows recent statements that Washington is preparing for sustained military operations, likely to include strikes on Iranian state and security facilities, rather than limited attacks on Iran's nuclear program, as seen during the 12-day war. The arrival of a second carrier, additional fighter jets and supporting assets, including aerial refueling, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, and air defense systems, will likely place the U.S. in a position to launch high-tempo offensive and defensive operations with minimal warning. On February 18th, Iran signaled to the U.S. that it will submit a formal written proposal to break the current diplomatic impasse, almost certainly in direct response to the increased U.S. military pressure. However, if Iran continues to delay the negotiation process or refuses to concede to key U.S. demands, the likelihood of U.S. strikes will rise, along with the risk of regional escalation, particularly if U.S. intelligence observes indicators of Iranian preparations for a kinetic response. Iran's recent NOTAM, which likely demonstrated its ability to launch long-range anti-ship cruise missiles from deep within its territory and adjust their trajectory mid-flight, together with naval drills in the Strait of Hormuz, has almost certainly been calibrated to reinforce deterrence and signal its ability to threaten high-value naval assets. Nevertheless, Iranian rhetoric and military posturing are unlikely to influence U.S. decision-making if Washington concludes that diplomatic options have been exhausted and that its current military posture is sufficient to neutralize Iranian threats. The increased likelihood of U.S. strikes has almost certainly shaped Israel's decision to raise its readiness posture. Israeli leaders almost certainly continue to assess that Iran's most likely course of action would involve large-scale ballistic missile and UAV attacks on Israel during the opening stages of any escalation, regardless of IDF involvement. Such a move would allow Iran to demonstrate strength and capability without immediately widening the conflict to Gulf states, although it would almost certainly lead to widespread airspace closures and disruption. However, if an initial round of kinetic exchanges fails to push Iran back to the negotiating table, the risk of broader regional escalation is likely to rise significantly. Tehran may calculate that a wider and more sustained retaliation, designed to impose regional costs, could increase pressure on the U.S. from its allies and help deter further escalation. And in Central Africa, Gabon's government has imposed a social media ban amid growing social discontent, a move that is likely to fuel further protests in Libreville. On February 17th, Gabon's High Authority for Communication, the national media regulator, announced the suspension of several social media platforms until further notice. It cited the spread of false information, cyberbullying, and the unauthorized disclosure of personal data as justification for the measure. No date was given for when access would be restored, and the announcement did not specify which platforms were affected. By February 18th, however, reports indicated that access to numerous platforms, including WhatsApp, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, had been restricted. Now, our intelligence assessment. The suspension is highly likely linked to the growing unpopularity of General Brice Oligui Nguema, who won the 2025 presidential election with more than 90% of the vote after leading a military coup in 2023. Following his victory, Nguema pledged to reform Gabon, where the Bongo family's long-dominant government had regularly imposed digital blackouts to control the flow of information. However, inflation has driven up the cost of living and fueled mounting social discontent. In recent months, numerous sectors have launched strikes over pay and working conditions. A nationwide teachers' strike over wage freezes has been underway since December 10th, Gabon's most serious labor movement since 2022, and similar demands have spread to other public sectors, including health, higher education, and broadcasting. According to data from October 2025, around 850,000 Gabonese citizens out of a population of 2.5 million were active social media users. Similar bans in other countries, such as Nepal, have triggered widespread youth-led protests. Youth demonstrations have become increasingly common in sub-Saharan Africa since 2024, and they often rely heavily on real-time updates, viral content, and live-streamed evidence of police brutality to sustain momentum. More authoritarian governments, including Uganda's, have preemptively restricted social media ahead of anticipated unrest to disrupt protester coordination, prevent the documentation of abuses by security forces, isolate activists, and halt the spread of anti-government sentiment. The Gabonese government has highly likely taken similar steps in response to rising social frustration. Gabon has experienced repeated episodes of nationwide unrest, most notably after Ali Bongo Ondimba's narrow victory in the 2016 presidential election, which triggered major protests met with mass arrests and the use of lethal force by security forces. Weeks of non-violent student demonstrations also took place in 2019 over new laws on scholarships and university grants. In response to the current social media ban, opposition leader Alain-Claude Billy Bianze has called on all Gabonese people dedicated to freedom to mobilize and block this liberty-destroying excess. Anti-government protests in Libreville are likely in the coming days and weeks, and could lead to significant transport disruption. If large demonstrations do occur, security forces are highly likely to respond with crowd dispersal measures such as tear gas and water cannon, alongside arrests and potentially the use of live ammunition. Now shifting to Asia Pacific, Bangladesh's opposition has accepted the results of the recent general elections, reducing the likelihood of immediate large-scale unrest, although politically motivated violence remains possible. The general elections, held on February 12th, were won by the Big Tent Bangladesh National Party, which secured more than a two-thirds majority in parliament. Jamaat-e-Islami, which had risen sharply in the polls in the months before the vote, won 77 seats with its allies, its best performance to date. BNP leader Tariq-e-Rahman was sworn in as Prime Minister on February 17th. The elections were held alongside a constitutional referendum on the July Charter, a document co-authored by 30 Bangladeshi parties after the July Revolution of 2024, which toppled the government of Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. As expected from pre-election polling, the yes vote won convincingly, securing 68.6% of the total vote. The voting process was marked by widespread reports of violence and confrontations between rival party supporters, resulting in more than 70 injuries and at least 3 deaths, including the killing of a BNP leader. Several parties initially alleged extensive fraud, although international observers, including the EU, described the vote as credible. Some parties also called for unrest after the results were published. J-White leaders, who now form the bulk of the parliamentary opposition, have since accepted the overall results of the vote. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The elections are highly likely to mark an important political milestone for Bangladesh, signaling the end of the transitional period that followed the July Revolution. The BNP's convincing victory was likely driven by its ability to inherit large portions of the Awami League electorate, with Hasina's party barred from competing, as well as by support from centrist and centre-left voters who backed the BNP to counter the socially conservative JI. In the short term, the BNP's strong electoral mandate will likely provide greater political stability for the new government. However, the administration will still need to confront significant challenges, including deep-rooted socio-economic and political issues in its first months in office. With a highly polarized electorate, any perceived neglect of these structural problems could quickly become a trigger for unrest. Despite the initial accusations of fraud, the decision by the main opposition parties, including JY, to accept the overall election results is likely to reduce the risk of political violence in the immediate term. However, other political groups have continued to claim that the vote was fraudulent. The most prominent accusations have come from the Awami League, despite the party having been barred from participating in the election. Alongside this, local political rivalries and tensions between the youth wings of various parties remain likely drivers of political violence in the medium term. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.